Prem Babaji said, used the phrase, separation is an illusion. I'm a student of physics. I chose to study non-separability in quantum theory because it's so clear that the separation constructed over 200 years of an age that I call the fossil fuel age needed a mechanistic mindset to facilitate all the changes, to make that machine move. It was a constructed machine, constructed our minds, made us believe that everything is a machine. Our bodies, I sometimes go to schools and we do a lot of work on food literacy, on eating healthy, on starting gardens of hope. And when I ask the children, what is your body? They'll say, the body is a machine, because that's what the textbooks teach them. And what is food? Fuel for the machine. If you look at agricultural textbooks, what is a plant? A plant is a machine. What is a chemical fertilizer? Fuel for that machine. What is the soil? An empty container for pouring that fuel into. I didn't study biology. I actually ran away from biology class because it required chopping up cockroaches in those days. I think it's evolved since then, but I stuck to my physics. And quantum theory taught us actually 100 years ago that non-separability and non-locality and action at a distance is the way even the physical world is organized. And of course, all that you are learning and teaching each other during this yoga festival is about a very ancient knowledge of interconnectedness, of oneness, of non-separation. You are going through so much depth. I peeked out of my window and saw the yoga class, and I said, yeah, one day I'll get there. But the oneness with nature, the non-separability with nature, has been my dedication in life. It's been my yoga in action. And began right here. This is my home. I'm born in Doon Valley. I learned my swimming in Mother Ganga. And you know, those were the days they didn't have those fancy tubes and all. And there used to be dalda, a horrible artificial fat, you know, hydrogenated vegetable fat. It used to be called dalda. And they'd have tins in the little stalls, and they tie the tin behind us, and you jumped into the river as your float. And of course, you learned very fast. I think we needed to hire those tins once. And all my early actions have been to protect the forests of the Ganga, beginning with Chipko. And that's why what Prem Babaji was saying about love. Our ecology movement began with the sisters in the mountains as an act of love. They could resist the destruction of logging by saying, we're going to hug the trees. We're going to do Chipko, which means to hug. And the movements that I've been part of over the last now nearly 45 years, 47 years, have all been able to sustain themselves when they flew out of love. Because love doesn't exhaust itself. Love renews itself. And the more interconnected it is, the more energy it gets and releases. Whereas there's a lot of activism in the world, and it works according to what in physics we say, dissipative structure. Eventually it all becomes entropy. It exhausts itself. Because we are part of the earth, and we were made to believe we are not, that is a big illusion, again of about 200 years. In India, we've always said, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. They were singing in a beautiful way about Vasudhaiva. Vasudhaiva is one of the names of Mother Earth. That's another thing I love about India as my home, our civilization. that we know that diversity is the basis of the expression of the oneness. That oneness is the reality, but diversity in nature, in society, and in each of us. We are not one thing. And that's what became part of the problem. You were reduced to one-dimensional machines for feeding the money machine. And that is what has become part of a deep violence against the earth, a deep violence against society, and a deep violence against our bodies. So beginning with the days of Chipko, I've dedicated my life to protecting biodiversity. And that's all I really wanted to do, protect biodiversity. But every action of protecting diversity has then shown us that in fact it is a better economy. Economy is derived from the same word from which ecology is derived. The roots are oikos, means the home in Greek language, and science of knowing our home is ecology, and managing our home is economy. But along the way, as we kept creating constructions, we substituted reality with amazing illusions, and I get fascinated with just a few decade-old illusion of something called gross domestic product, the GDP. It was a construction made to mobilize resources for the war. And it had to create the illusion that there is no life in nature, there is no life in society, and there's no production. And the definition of the accounting system that began at that time was, if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. So when through yoga you're nourishing your bodies and your health, it's not a health system. No, you got to take a lethal pharmaceutical drug with huge side effects, and then you have good growth. But before that, if you eat rotten food and get very sick, that contributes to growth. It contributes to the growth of the selling of poisons. It contributes to growth of royalty payments, an issue that takes a lot of my time, because that too is a fiction. Life is not an invention. Life is, and life evolves. And adding one gene along the way doesn't create the life before and the life that's coming. Even though once you have an intellectual property right on life, then you have to pretend it's a machine that you invented. And all the future generations, for example, of seed, are self-replicating machines that farmers steal. It is actually fascinating how far we could have manufactured these illusions and allowed them to rule our policies, our lives, our imagination. I didn't accept it, of course, when all this was being put into place in the World Free Trade Agreements and GATT and WTO, and I just said, no, seed is not an invention. It is a commons that calls for us to care for it, and I will personally dedicate the rest of my life to saving seeds of every kind. The seeds that give us food, but the seeds that are able to give us freedom and seeds of truth. Because we do live in a fascinating post-truth age. And therefore this work of yoga becomes even more vital. Because just like when I started to save seed, everyone would say, how do you think a little bit of seed can take on these giant empires? I said, first, just in the imagination, because recognizing that seeds are self-organized, renewable, reproduce themselves, have evolutionary potential to adapt to changing climates, Just that in itself is the work done. Because you've, in that seed, embodied another imagination, another commitment. But because seeds multiply, you save one seed, you've saved 1,000. My favorite food and favorite crop, and I think it will be foods of the future, are what we in Navdanya, the movement I started in 87, which means 9 seeds and is for seed saving, are the millets. We call them forgotten foods. And when I was reading, the roots of the word millet come from million. So whether it's the barnyard millet or the finger millet, the seeds are so tiny that you plant a seed, it holds 1,000,000. Tiny little seeds. And interestingly, they were called primitive crops. Had to be wiped out. One reason they were called primitive was because they grow in very marginal lands, and therefore, of course, the poor use them. But more importantly, they were called primitive because they couldn't be manipulated that easily. The seeds are so tiny that the violence of manipulation doesn't work so much. And the reason there will be future foods is they use 1/10 the water of growing chemical irrigated paddy. And if we were growing millets as our staple, which they should be, we could have 400 times the nutrition on this planet. We wouldn't have to kill the rivers to bring water where there isn't water. We wouldn't have to irrigate crops in regions where the rain will give you a good crop, the millets. But I think there's another little reason why the millets were considered primitive. You know, they're dark, they're black. And there's this bias against black. So we do festivals which say black is beautiful. And then we put all the nutrition in the ragi, in the gora, and my colleagues have worked so hard, our farmers have worked so hard, that today it has now again become fashionable to eat. Do you have ragi biscuits? They come. Also because so many children now are being born autistic. Multiple causes. Bruce would have talked about how, there's no one gene that's causing changes that are multi-causal. But there's no one cause either, because complex systems interact in complex ways. And that's why causality in Indian thought and causality in quantum theory recognizes complex causality. And it avoids the idea of deterministic outcomes. That this particle moving with this velocity will reach this point. Because the world isn't particles. The world isn't billiard balls. Amazingly complex, self-organized beings, beginning from ourselves. But the other thing I've learned in this 1 year, while trying to see the deeper connections between our food and our health, is not just that when we take care of the soil and do the yoga for care for the earth, organic farming is nothing more than giving back to the earth with love. Industrial farming is nothing more than continuing war by another name. And when I say that, I'm referring to the fact that every input of industrial farming has come from the war. Before that, we did agriculture with the earth. But chemicals were evolved to kill some people in concentration camps. That became pesticides. Chemicals were evolved to make ammunition and bombs. That became chemical urea fertilizers, fixing nitrogen from the air. And I always laugh and smile to myself. I said, nature knew so much more, and farmers knew so much more, because we know non-violently plants that are leguminous plants can fix nitrogen for the soil without having to turn agriculture into leftovers of a bomb and ammunition. So you might recall that most of the time nowadays, a lot of terrorism is using what are called fertilizer bombs. Oklahoma was the first. Oslo, Hyderabad, the High Court in Delhi, and all of Afghanistan. Because the American CIA thought we'll bribe the Taliban by giving them lots of fertilizer so they get disenchanted with the Soviet Union. There was a Soviet Union at that time. And so every hut is equipped with sacks of chemical fertilizer. Huge supplies. So each time now the Taliban has to organize itself, all it does is make another bomb. Because making explosives was the original nature and characteristic of those. But in addition, there is the war in the mind. When Prem Baba talks about the oneness through love, there's a separation through the fear of the other so deep that every insect is an enemy to be exterminated. You know, those insects include the bees and the butterflies that pollinate our crops. On our Navdanya farm, which I hope some of you will visit after this yoga festival, we've been doing studies on pollination. 1/3 of the food we eat was not produced by us. The pollinators produced it. We haven't done enough work on how much the soil organisms give us, because they're much more complex. But we can see how soils where we haven't given back with love and are starting to get desertified and losing their fertility, including those we fertilize with chemical fertilizers. We just did a 20-year study. When you put chemical fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer in the soil, the nitrogen, it's supposed to increase nitrogen, the nitrogen in the soil has gone down 22%. When you don't apply chemical fertilizers and just say thank you to the earth by giving back part of what she's given you, organic matter, she has increased nitrogen with all those amazing microbes in the soil up to 100%. But soils with urea have no zinc, which is why you're getting zinc deficiencies, magnesium deficiencies. Years ago, Bruce and I were at an Uplift festival, and there was a strong group of public health people. Some of them visited us later. They said, they do brain chemistry to diagnose disease. 50% of Australian teenagers were coming up with depression. Most of them had zinc deficiency. All you have to do is say thank you to the earth, and she gives you enough zinc. Magnesium, everyone is now talking of attention deficit disorder as if it's intrinsic to human beings. And they're giving them huge drugs, terrible, terrible toxic drugs. Magnesium is there in organic soils, and therefore it's in organic plants, therefore it's in our food. So our health actually begins in the soil and is a product of the yoga with the earth. Because this needs a huge leap of humility, because part of being machines was also part of being on the top of a pyramid. Remember? Man was on top of the pyramid, and all other species were below. And the microbes were the last. But we are dependent on them. We're not just dependent on them, we're in the soil doing this amazing work in the soil food web. We are 90% them. Now they're realizing that the gut is an amazing ecosystem, the gut microbiome, and has trillions of microbes, all of whom are either destroyed or nourished according to the food we eat. And some of my friends who work on some of these connections are finding that when the food is lacking in nutrition, because industrial farming produces nutritionally empty food with lots of toxics. So there's a double harm. The first harm is the 90% of us isn't getting its full diet. The second harm is the toxics are then harming the rest. So the issue of autism is so linked to the gut microbiome. And doctors who are starting to understand this and starting to treat, especially children, with good diets, they are being considered a danger to health. And their licenses are being revoked. And this is particularly true of France and the United States. To do yoga and to know your connection, of course, is a violation of a mechanistic worldview. And if the mechanistic worldview is the one that has to be defended, then any ecological understanding becomes a threat. We've lived through a British colonialism, and they saw everything indigenous as a threat. Ayurveda was banned, and it survived. And if you look at the drawings during the colonial period of the crazy Indians who have their feet on their head, because you do yoga sometimes, your feet are above, but they actually drew us with feet on our head. And again, that was one reason we had to be civilized. But the fact that you're all here shows that that project of civilizing us didn't work either. And then there's the food issue. For so long, there's been this attempt to civilize our agriculture, which means both civilize the earth into being monocultures, sprayed because every insect is a dangerous enemy, and every plant that grows on its own or grows as a companion, so dangerous. So you even invent things like glyphosate and Roundup to exterminate what are called weeds. Now, Indian agriculture is based on diversity. We've never grown crops by themselves. They're always grown as mixtures. Even rice, which might not have a plant companion, has lots of fish companions and ducks. And those systems produce far more when you count the duck and the rice, or the shrimp and the rice. But if you count rice alone, and you only measure the commodity that leaves the farm, you say not producing enough. Which is why separation then becomes the mode not only for the GDP. When you extract, you have GDP. When you recycle, you don't, because giving back doesn't count. Or in agriculture, when you extract commodities, you have increase of GDP. But when the soil is nourished, when families are nourished, when society is healthy, no increase of food, because food also is measured according to the yield that leaves the ecosystem and the farm. So the poorer the soils get, the more the growth. The consequences of this are huge, that as the industrial system grows, there's more hunger, there's more malnutrition, there's more disease. But there are other externalities that we often don't connect. I started to look at agriculture in 1984, when Punjab erupted in violence. And interestingly, the Green Revolution, which was first implemented in Punjab, was given a Nobel Peace Prize, that the chemicals would bring peace. Punjab was a land of war in the 80s. And the military was sent, Golden Temple was invaded. The story carries on. Even Trudeau, who tried to visit India the other day, had a kind of a cold shoulder because many of the people in his government, are still angry about that Golden Temple being invaded by the army. Of course, there's another illusion that was created in the process. It was an anger of farmers that was leading to every problem. But some people cooked up a word called Khalistan. There was no movement for Khalistan in Punjab. There was a movement for fair prices for the farmers. And on 4th of June, when the army was sent to the Golden Temple, the farmers had decided we're not going to live in slavery. They said we can't decide what we'll grow, how we'll grow it, what price it will sell at. This is slavery. And we want to be free. They weren't saying we want a separate state called Khalistan. That, I've been told, became a very convenient word for people living outside India, not in Punjab. Punjab, of course, still has a problem. And the problem is the army neutralized the violence, but it neutralized the violence externally. The discontent is still there. Now farmers commit suicide. 300,000 suicides in India in the last 2 decades. Because of the violence, it's a vicious circle, as Prem Baba said. Just like love has virtuous circles, violence, born of separation, leads to bigger and bigger cycles of violence. I've watched that in Punjab. I've watched that in Bhopal, where a leak of a pesticide plant killed 7,000 people in that one night, which was so clear that these chemicals were designed to kill, not just pests, but humans too. And I started a little campaign then called No More Bhopals, Let's Plant a Neem, which is a beautiful tree which controls pests without violence. And then 10 years later, that was patented. That was another 11 years of dealing with that theft and piracy. 11 years we fought the case in the European Patent Office, and we won. Of course, we had brought the challenge also to the US Patent Office, and we got a letter back. What's your commercial interest? We said, we don't have a commercial interest. We just care for the earth and society. And they said, sorry, we only entertain competition between commercial interests. So there is no common good, there is no care, there is no love, just greed, greed, greed. And we'll decide who's greedier, and they'll win. And of course, this commodity model of agriculture is feeding nobody. 70% of the food still comes from small farms, only 30% comes from industrial farms. And right now, the explosion in crops is GMO corn and soya. Brazil is full of Roundup resistant soya. US is GM corn and soya. Argentina is overtaken with GM soya. 10% of it is going into the food system. The rest is biofuel and animal feed. Because once it's a commodity, it doesn't matter where it fits. Yeah? The same commodity could run a car, torture an animal, or pretend to feed us, except that we can be fooled. Our gut microbiome is smarter. Doesn't get fooled. It deals with it through expressions of health or expressions of sickness. We, of course, have it in our hands through the yoga of action, through a yoga with the earth, to do farming in ways that is non-violent and regenerates the soil, the biodiversity, the water, food, our health. At Navdanya, not only do we actually do the work, we then sit and do the calculations, because I find, even though the whole mechanistic system is based on quantification. The numbers are manipulated. When they say more food, there's less food. When they say bigger economy, there's a shrinkage of the economy in terms of the real economy that takes care of people's needs. So we did assessments of our small biodiverse farms and organic farms. We could feed 2 times India's population by caring for the earth. That's all we have to do. With real food, real nourishment. And even more importantly, the farmers who are conserving biodiversity, who are doing organic farming, and are not in the trap of exploitation, where prices keep falling for the farmers. Our farmer members are earning 10 times more than the commodity crop growers. The soya farmers are earning 100 times less than the bean farmers of the mountains. The organic cotton farmers are earning 10 times more than the BT cotton farmers. You could just run it through many, many crops. So the farmers do better, and the eater does better. So the health is one continuum, from nature to us and across society. For me, the most beautiful part of it has been recognizing that most of the greenhouse gases that are destabilizing climate systems are coming from industrial model of agriculture, with emissions of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, 50%. 100% solution lies in taking care of the earth. Because there's only one, just like when you do your yoga, there's only one way of healing the body, allowing the body's systems to become active again. It's the same with the earth. The 2 cycles that have been totally ruptured and are leading to climate instability are the cycles of carbon and the cycles of nitrogen. And the nitrogen cycle is ruptured by chemical fertilizers. The carbon cycle ruptured by both cutting down forests and reducing the plant intensity, as well as emitting more, because your absorption capacity is going down. But the soil is a very, very big reservoir. And the more we grow living systems, the more we return to the earth, and that's how the carbon cycle gets healed. That's how we address climate change. Not through fear, but through love and interconnectedness. And that's why I promote gardens of hope everywhere, because a lot of people seeing climate change data panic. They just become very afraid. And when you're afraid, you adopt every nonsense. I was once on a big security debate, and everyone else, this was around the time when the boats were coming from Africa. And I was looking at the roots of how people are being uprooted. The Syrian crisis began with 1 million farmers being uprooted. The combination of agriculture that wasn't nourishing the soil had depleted the water, and climate change and drought. And the same for Africa. Boko Haram is being created around Lake Chad, which is shrunk to nothing from 22,000 square kilometers. Every security person, where security only means militarized action, was saying, got to bomb the boats, bomb the boats, bomb the boats. Right now, I know today's the 5th. Yesterday there was an election in Italy. And 50% of Italians are now out of work because there was a financial crash in 2008 in the United States. But that financial crash was then transmitted all the way around the world. We were saved because we didn't have integration with the global financial markets. Unfortunately, now we do. So we were protected. But 50% youth don't have work. And all of the new systems are creating a very precarious future for young people. Because everything that gave security is being treated as an old model that has to be put aside. public health, public education, public transport, public energy. Got to put it all in the market. And I was reading the other day that £1 billion extra is being extracted by companies from people in England for heating charges. So what's the solution? Have more companies. And they're somehow thinking the mechanism that leads to exploitation will reduce the exploitation. No, it will just have a larger number for people to get confused about. And just like they ask you to change your mobile service all the time, they'll ask you to keep changing your gas service all the time. But talking about mobile services and talking about the new world in the making, a world that carries us further down violence and separation on the one hand, and a world that we care about, of oneness, of unity, of love, of healing. So there are two things that are very big in the world right now. And when every magazine uses absolutely same text, I start to think this was not journalists. So artificial intelligence is supposed to take over. What is artificial intelligence? Downloading a few functions of our brain, some mechanistic functions. We were talking earlier of the left brain, right brain. Some analytic mechanistic functions, downloading it into machines. And then the machines can replay it through algorithms. This is supposed to take over. No, it can't take over the creativity and intelligence that is in every cell of yours that becomes active when you do yoga. A computer won't start doing yoga. That's one thing that's beyond its reach. They might mechanize a few algorithms for some asanas, but not beyond. I mean, they might have some bad yoga teachers on a screen. Still not be the full knowing body. So you know how algorithms have worked in the last election for the US? Facebook communications were transformed into algorithms, but all based on hate. Because love, you have to live. You live love. You don't outsource love. But hate can be externalized and go into algorithms, can become advertisements for elections. And you know where that election went. But the other is the Newsweek or Times this week has looking for intelligence on other planets. First of all, that means continuing the mechanistic myth and illusion that there's no intelligence in us, there's no intelligence in the plants, there's no intelligence in the Ganga, there's no intelligence on this earth, it's somewhere else. So they're all looking. Mr. Elon Musk is spending huge amounts of money on SpaceX. Even poor Stephen Hawking, such a brilliant scientist, said in an interview last year that extinction is inevitable. False, because extinction is inevitable if we continue on the same path, which is not inevitable. Because we can be different. We can let our intelligence work to make the choices out of interconnectedness, out of non-separation. Saying extinction within the next century, yes. On the projection of the current regime, yes. Species will go, the climate will become havoc. The conditions that have given us life on this bountiful Mother Earth will be destroyed. She'll find other beings to nourish. But the niche for us, our species, will be closed. So instead of saying, let's change the way we function, they're saying, let's escape to Mars. Well, first of all, there's no life on Mars. They're spending so much money trying to find out how food will grow on Mars. And Elon Musk even had in his article, and I will find a way to make it affordable to ship Pizza Hut there. And if you have a choice of eating Pizza Hut after paying $1 billion ticket on the space shuttle that he's organizing, but there's a very simple way. And that simplicity is the yoga of the earth, the yoga of love, the yoga of action. problems are too big and I'm too small, I take inspiration from the seed, which is so small, but changes everything. Each of us is a seed for another future. And let's tell Mr. Hawkins and the myth of masks, there isn't a century on this planet, there are many centuries for all beings, and we will live in interconnectedness. Thank you.